Hello my friends, it's Kat here, and welcome to a first on the channel. Today we are going to attempt to do our first book review ever, because I never freaking read, of George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood, published in 2018 originally, and this of course is the reference material for HBO's House of the Dragon. As I've stated, I've never filmed a book review before, but I just really wanted to share my thoughts on this because it turned out way better than I thought it was going to be. And listen, I didn't go in with low expectations, but I feel like the way this book is pitched within the Game of Thrones fandom, especially the context in which it is written, told through the narrative of several different maesters and whatnot, eyewitness reports, not entirely necessarily a factual telling of the events that go down. It naturally is very different from any book that I have ever read before, but I went into it, I think, with a certain expectation. Instead, it ended up blowing my socks off, and now I just learned this term, book hangover. When you finish a book and you miss it and you wish you still had it and you can't stop thinking about it. As many of you guys know, I am a Game of Thrones fan via the TV shows, so yeah, I'm a fake fan in that regard. I do have yet to read any of the Song of Ice and Fire series, the Game of Thrones novels. Let me know, folks, if I imagine they're written very differently from Fire and Blood, but if they're anywhere near the same caliber as this, I imagine. Let me know, because I'm about to plow through them, because once I got cooking with this,
we're firing 76 beefs!
Was I wrong to start with this one in my Game of Thrones endeavors, starting to get into more of the literature? Obviously, this is a prequel, so I guess I am not chronologically wrong. However, in terms of the writing style and the presentation of the story as a historical retelling, as I said, I've never read anything like this. I fear I may never read anything like this again, because yes, I am a historical fiction fan. That has always been one of my favorite, if not absolute favorite genre of novels, but this is historical fiction dialed up with the fantasy, dialed up with the dragons. It's got everything going for it. I should also admit that if it weren't for House of the Dragon, the HBO series, I'm gonna be entirely honest and just disclaim that I probably never would have read the book. My true intentions with the book, I picked it up and bought it originally after season 1 ended, and I suffer from this awful habit called going to Barnes & Noble, buying a new book just to get that thrill, only to then bring it home and have it sit on my dresser and collect dust for a year. And even with House of the Dragon, I watched Game of Thrones without reading any of those books. I truly, genuinely bought this just to disclaim, because I had seen every single spoiler under the sun for the entirety of what goes down with Team Green and Team Black, Rhaenyra versus Aegon. The Game of Thrones fandom is very liberal when it comes to throwing out spoilers and sharing everything, especially because the book is described as a textbook very commonly, I feel like, within the fandom. And in fact, many of you guys here who watch my House of the Dragon videos encouraged me not to read the book because it is not necessarily a factual, reliable retelling of the events. We are pretty much informed right out of the gate that we can't necessarily trust everything that happens in the book. It's all potentially hearsay. There are very few retellings of events that are said with their full chest, said with certainty. So for that reason, I questioned whether I would even enjoy this book, considering it's one described as a historical textbook. I'm going to be real with y'all. That alone was a huge turnoff for me, because every textbook, historical textbook specifically, social studies that I ever read in high school, I just fell the frick asleep. So sorry if you're a history teacher watching this. Listen, if every textbook actually was written like this, I would not put that shiz down. I was not exactly super interested going in, and I kind of was just approaching it as a chore, just as a necessity in order to cure my FOMO of just seeing all of the spoilers online, so I figured why not just read it with my own eyes. It did not take me 2+ years to read it. In fact, once I got started, once I got the ball rolling, I probably sat down and read this in 4 sittings total. And as I said, my attitude changed real quickly. I would be sitting down deep in the thick of it, reading this for maybe 4 to 5 hour chunks at a time. Yeah, I'm a freaking slow reader, but this is also like 600+ pages. It's usually impossible for me to stick to something for a 5-hour period of reading just straight through. And one thing that became abundantly clear pretty early on is that this doesn't flow like a freaking textbook, y'all. I think people are shooting this book in the foot. I don't think people are doing this justice by describing it as a textbook, because it certainly does not frickin' flow like that at all, folks. When I hear textbook, I hear getting snoozed to sleep. This was riveting, exciting, it flows continuously. You find yourself pouring through like 70 years in the timeline within just one sitting of reading, because it has those fantastical elements. You're reading a fantasy textbook in a sense, yes, because it dates all the way back to Aegon the Conqueror's timeline and whatnot, and then spans for hundreds more years or whatnot. I can't do math, but I wasn't necessarily accounting for the passage of time, but you cross over generations, you know, decades of the Targaryens following Aegon the Conqueror, but it's not tedious. There's 50 people named Aegon, but it's actually surprisingly easy to keep track. I would say the only thing I wish this book had more of was dialogue. It is definitely not very dialogue heavy. It's much more third person. For the most part, it's mainly narrative. There are some sequences of dialogue here, or perhaps a direct quote from a certain character here or there, or, you know, what people heard through the grapevine, you know, people's words getting misconstrued, of course, and whatnot. But I typically do prefer dialogue heavy writing just because I'm a very imaginative reader, so I like to envision the scenes happening in my mind, but I think that void was filled by virtue of the fact that I read this imagining all of the characters from the television show in my head, which normally I don't necessarily like to do that. I like to have my own imaginations and not just draw right from the show, with that being my first impression, my first understanding of the characters. I think in this case it helped me. It served as a crutch in a way to kind of fill that void so that I could play out the scenes in my mind with the cast already available to me. Most of the time, if there are some very few direct quotes in here, then you can count on the fact that that's actually true. That was actually one of the few probably factual retellings that we have in this book that the maesters have witnessed and whatnot, and it was fun to draw comparisons and see which quotes that they took directly from the book. Now, when it comes to the storyline itself, I am going to be focusing primarily in this review on the Dance of the Dragons, of course, just because, as I said, I read this primarily to go in conjunction with House of the Dragon, so that's what I was drawing from, especially when I got to that section, but I didn't realize you had to read like 400 pages before you can even get to Rhaenyra's, you know, all that timeline. But I would like to disclaim up front that, in all honesty, 90% of the other timeline with the Targaryens in this book, Jaehaerys, Aegon the Conqueror, everything that unfolds with that. Honestly, some of the Targaryen reigns that preceded the Dance of the Dragons in here I found to be genuinely more exciting at some points, even though I quickly realized, oh shoot, I have to read like 400 pages before I can even get to any of the relevant material that I know from the show. Everything else in here is still equally riveting, equally exciting, and that was the fun part for me because I didn't have the show casts and characters to draw from for that, so I could employ my own imagination and whatnot, so it was still equally enjoyable to read the elements of this that weren't inspired by the show, that I have the mental comparisons to draw from, so that was a nice way to shake things up. So obviously, one of the major reasons that I picked this book up in the first place is to determine the main burning question of who actually wins in the end, Team Green or Team Black. And as a ride or die, a Team Black stan, y'all know that I am pleased to report that, in my opinion, we seal the deal in the end, y'all. Because yes, even though Rhaenyra gets absolutely incinerated and Dracarys into oblivion, whose kid sits on the Iron Throne, y'all? Whose bloodline keeps going and takes the throne? Fricking Rhaenyra's, that's right. We get them on a technicality at the end of the day, y'all. Yes, even though we lose Rhaenyra, even though Aegon technically wins a little bit, he's victorious for a smidge, a brief little sliver of time. It's Rhaenyra's bloodline that is persevering, y'all, at the end of the day. We've got Aegon III inheriting the Iron Throne, and yes, he is temporarily married to little 10-year-old Jaehaerys, who is the grandchild of Alicent Hightower, the daughter of Aegon and Helaena. However, unfortunately, that was a very short-lived marriage. Come for me all you want, call me out, tell me I'm wrong. Rhaenyra wins at the end of the day, y'all. Team Black's bloodline continues. So I am still counting this one as a win. Now, yes, after all is said and done, Team Green has their fair share of survivors too, but dare I say, I feel like they end up in a little bit more of shambles than we do. Alicent Hightower is the one to persevere through it all. She's kind of the last of the Greens. This, of course, brings me to my next point, and I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't touch on this, and I now understand why there's a lot of discourse surrounding this. I see quite a lot of comparisons to book Alicent versus television series Alicent, and I just want to disclaim up front that none of my criticism here about what they've done with her character in the show, now that I've read the book, has anything to do with the actress's performance. She is star-studded, she is incredible, she's fabulous and beautiful and just dripping with amazingness. And I love what she's done with the character that they've written for her, but I find Alicent's character, her storyline, her motivations, everything she does, her actions to be the biggest deviation in the television show from the book. My biggest question would have to be, what is the primary reason for altering Alicent's kind of, I don't want to say moral compass in a way, but in Fire and Blood, she's much more hardcore. She's ride or die Team Green till the very end. No matter what, even when she's literally lost everything. Like, there is no way she can claw her family back. She has no family to claw back with. She has one little descendant left, Jaehaera. But even then, after everything is said and done, Alicent in Fire and Blood is whispering to Jaehaera to slit Aegon's throat. Like, she's still doing everything she possibly can to try to weasel her way back to the throne, even when literally all hope is lost and all of her own children are dead and gone. And I say this admitting that Alicent that they have created in the television series, the HBO adaptation, I would still argue that she is one of the most complex and intriguing characters of the show. I often fixate on her, particularly because I think they have constructed her with a more gray moral compass. She's not entirely ride or die Team Green, especially as we've seen in the season 2 finale. And I do believe that they altered her age range a little bit, tweaked that to make her more of a mirror with Rhaenyra, you know, to raise them, introduce them as the best friend turned enemies kind of trope. But when it comes to the series, I do find myself gravitating toward Alicent's inner conflict the most. So I don't want this to come across as a criticism of the Alicent that they have created in House of the Dragon, now that I've read the book and am a little more informed about her roots. Out of all of the characters, I feel like there's the most stark difference with her portrayal in the book. And listen, I'll be the first to admit also that I've even gotten flack on here for lacking sympathy at times for Alicent, but now that I've read the book version, y'all, Alicent in Fire and Blood shows no mercy, you know? I will also acknowledge, I do think her character in the show has been granted way more attention than she receives in the book, because there are many times in the book where she goes dormant and you don't exactly know what's going on with her. So Alicent in the show definitely has a lot of duality and goes back and forth, you know, debating her own internal conflict, her duties to the realm, her responsibility to her family, her children, but also her core friendship, and the fact that I do genuinely believe she loved Viserys at the end of the day and wants to do right by the realm. She is always guided by the want to do the right thing, and her remaining compassion for Rhaenyra is always, I think, tethering her to that, keeping her grounded. Whereas book Alicent, I will say, is definitely a little bit more one-sided, and instead of sending her full Team Green, especially following the realization, you know, the confrontation she has with Rhaenyra, trying to backtrack as best as she can, using whatever she has left of her power before Aemond kind of strips her of it to damage control and prevent the inevitable chaos, because I think she accepts that she made a mistake, versus Alicent in this book literally was letting Viserys' body rot so that she could usurp the throne. Like, she was making moves. But after reading all of this, I'm inclined to suspect that Alicent's confrontation here with Rhaenyra in the season 2 finale, in which she's essentially saying, head over to King's Landing and I'll leave the door open for you, I'm a little more inclined to feel like that could just be bait. The Alicent in this book would never actually bend the knee, and if she did, I think that would be as an element of trickery, of sabotage. She would never throw her son under the bus. Everything she does in this book is truly for her children and their best interest. Yes, perhaps with the interests of the realm at heart, since she's been in that game for frickin' ever, but as I mentioned, she's whispering in little Jaehaera's ear to slit Aegon III's throat while he's not looking. Like, that girl's 10. If there is one last drop of her bloodline out there, she's gonna milk that for all that she can. So it's clear that the series has gone out of its way, I would argue, now that I've read the book, to not only establish Alicent and Rhaenyra as, I wouldn't say kindred spirits in a way, but tethered by their mutual respect and love for one another, as well as the love that they both shared for Viserys. That connects them, I think, way more than it does in the book. But Alicent in here, once she hits the fan, she's not backing down. She is fanning those flames. She doesn't quit until all her options are spent. Hence why I'm curious and now potentially questioning her decision here and her motive to essentially not necessarily bend the knee to Rhaenyra. She hasn't done that in totality just yet, but to essentially say, I'm laying down, here's my key,
Aemon will soon fly to join Cole in the Riverlands. I will see to it that our guards throw down their arms. We will open the gates. We will shed no blood.
She's luring Rhaenyra, encouraging her, come to King's Landing and I'll let you in, even if it means risking Aegon's life.
If I am to take the throne, I must put an end to the opposition. I must take Aegon's head.
I'm questioning now whether that is genuine or whether that could be part of a ruse. Because the Alicent that we've seen in season 2 is slowly deteriorating the second she learns the truth about misinterpreting Viserys' dying breath, knowing that she robbed the throne in bad faith. So I do believe that this could be a move of her genuinely wanting to do right by the realm, right her wrongs, leave the door open for Rhaenyra because she does believe Rhaenyra would bring peace. She's trying at all costs to avoid the loss of life as much as she possibly can, even if that comes at the cost of her own son's life, which in this book she wouldn't do that, but that's why I'm like, could this be a trap? I don't know.
It's a trap!
So even if this is in good faith, her approach with Rhaenyra to come to King's Landing, I think things could be exacerbated once Rhaenyra gets there and sees that Aegon's pieced the frick out. I could see this turning into a misunderstanding or a conflict in which she accuses Alicent of being in on all of that. Like, you've tricked me, you lured me here under the guise that we can eliminate your son because as long as he's still living, he threatens my claim. But he's not here. The one piece to barter with is gone. And I feel like she could maybe throw that in Alicent's face, and regardless of how Alicent might protest, she's unaware that Aegon has fled. As far as we know. So I could see that spiraling into, yet again, another freaking misunderstanding between the two of them, with Rhaenyra believing that Alicent is entirely in on Aegon's disappearance and therefore losing any and all trust in her. My other major question, though, is the fact that the siege of King's Landing for Rhaenyra and Daemon when they come to finally claim the throne, it's the kindling of the resentment that starts to brew amongst the small folk against Rhaenyra. She has to somehow go from point A to point B, which is being the realm's delight, you know, everybody adores her and showers her with love, to they literally wage a freaking, like, they do everything in their power, the small folk, to overthrow her. They essentially lead to her downfall, I would say. But all of that starts when Rhaenyra and Daemon take King's Landing by force, not because Alicent let them in. I'm struggling admittedly to imagine a scenario in which Team Black can just stroll in there casually with Alicent leaving the key under the mat, when in reality I think there needs to be something not peaceful about her taking King's Landing. There needs to be some sort of violent catalyst that spawns the disdain that starts to, you know, grow and fester within the small folk that turns everyone against Rhaenyra. Especially since, what do we learn as soon as she takes the throne? Unfortunately, she gets sliced and diced, aka the throne is clearly rejecting her. Now, listen, as a ride or die Team Black stan, okay, I cannot deny the writings, the sacred text. The Iron Throne, I would argue, is very immediately rejecting Rhaenyra, literally stabbing her and drawing blood. And I think Rhaenyra knows that, as does everybody else who witnesses it, so it doesn't bode well for her very short-lived reign. I am willing to reconcile with that. Now, whether this is because she genuinely was unfit for the throne, which would be an utter heartbreak, especially since I do believe that the show especially has framed her to be the desired, the more favorable. And for me, at least, I find it easier to root for Rhaenyra, and I think Viserys was steadfast in always championing her, whether the throne retaliates and pokes her and stabs her because she really is unfit, or if it's another larger metaphor, you know, literally nailing in the message of this whole show, which is that no matter what, the realm would just never let a woman sit the Iron Throne. No matter what, Rhaenyra could never sit peacefully on the Iron Throne. She could never rule. The realm would just never accept a woman. You know, that's kind of the bitter truth that she's been dodging this entire show, but at the end of the day, that could just be the reality. So I don't know if it has something to do with her as a failed ruler, just doomed from the start, or whether it speaks for the realm. But either way, I accept that the throne freaking stabbed her and she was leaking like a sieve after she sat up from it for the first time. So I will stand by the fact that in the series, without question, I think it glorifies Rhaenyra for now. But however, upon reading this, I am very curious to see if this turns into a little bit of a Daenerys Targaryen character transformation, which Would be curious to see how that goes down, especially, you know. But of course, as we see in the book, she does kind of descend a little bit, kind of just desperately grasping at something that maybe never should have belonged to her in the first place. It drives her to lose trust in everyone, as we've seen, you know, similarly with Daenerys, you know, she was left with essentially no one at the end before she snaps. I just couldn't help but think about Daenerys for some reason when I was reading about Rhaenyra's story. I don't know if there's meant to be a link between the two of them or any sort of parallel in their storylines, but very similarly to Daenerys, as we learn, Rhaenyra kind of starts to spiral as soon as she gets the power that she's been wanting. Alicent and Rhaenyra, of course, are some of the main book comparisons that I wanted to highlight in this review, but I'm going to briefly touch on a few other things that I'm curious to see how they will be handled, or if they're just going to be entirely withheld from the show and why they've chosen to do that and deviate from that a little bit. But main one being Nettles. Where's she at? Nettles is a literal child dragon rider for Team Black, currently absent in the television series as of now, and I'm curious whether they will actually incorporate her at all, if they're going to try to finesse around that storyline to, you know, I think essentially Nettles serves as she's desirable for Daemon, whether she actually tempts him or not. You know, there's questions about their relationship that they had in the book. She ultimately kind of serves as a temptation for him, which leads Rhaenyra to spiral to believe that, you know, Daemon has ultimately betrayed her, forsaken her. You know, when Rhaenyra dies, she truly believes that she's been abandoned and betrayed by everyone, Daemon especially. When Daemon dies, you know, he unfortunately dies thinking that, you know, Rhaenyra has lost all trust in him, and that maybe she no longer loves him and sees him as a traitor. So they kind of established a little bit of the pathway to a Daemon betrayal. You know, they were kind of setting that up for the entirety of season 2 as he's spiraling over at Harrenhal, but they remedied that, and it's clear that he came around. He had a reckoning. I'm curious if they scrapped the Nettles storyline in favor of Daemon doing his own thing at Harrenhal, you know, marching around like he owns the place, ordering everyone to call him king, being all insufferable and all that while he's having his hallucinations and whatnot. But that essentially was the same storyline of establishing a sense of, is he going to betray Rhaenyra? That, however, makes me curious after reading the book, though, because in my opinion, my interpretation, nothing about this other than one distinct line from Otto Hightower in which he suggests, you know, to the Green Council that there's no way, shape, or form they can let Rhaenyra take the throne because everyone knows that it would just be Daemon governing everything. It would be his realm, not hers, you know, suggesting that he would be the true ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. Nothing about this led me to believe that Daemon would betray Rhaenyra. Honestly, nothing about this led me to believe that anything that Daemon does isn't in Rhaenyra's best interests. Yes, blood and cheese, not great, but after that, he doesn't necessarily, unless I read this wrong, I don't think he goes to Harrenhal and spirals and has thoughts of betrayal, so perhaps none of that necessarily comes around till Nettles, and even then, yeah, does he get a little too attached to her? Perhaps, but it still remains vague enough that you don't necessarily know where his intentions lie, but I do believe at the end of the day, he dies fighting for Rhaenyra. He never would betray her, and it probably breaks his heart and hurts him to think that she believes that he would betray her, that she sees him as a traitor as he's giving his life for her. That remains to be seen if they're going to pursue that storyline or introduce Nettles eventually, but for now they've remedied that, and Daemon is fully recommitted as we've seen him, so maybe they're going to reopen that can of worms, you know, down the line as Rhaenyra starts to spiral more, because of course her feelings of Daemon potentially betraying her are kind of, you know, major contributors to her ultimate just downfall, her descent. And finally, one very last extremely miscellaneous point that feels weird to end this on because it's just so random, but we still have yet to see a lot of this character's true intentions, but the way that they have introduced him into the show, a good man, you know, I'm rooting for him. Hugh Hammer, what the frick?
I was rooting for you! We were all rooting for you! How dare you!
Turns into the master betrayer, like, what? I guess we do have yet to see how necessarily honorable he is as portrayed in the show. You know, they've planted, I guess, a little bit of seeds that as he's pitching to his wife, I have to go and claim one of these dragons, and if we're successful, look at what could happen to you. You could become a princess or something. You could become a lady. Like, we could have higher rankings in society. We could be rewarded with that, with titles.
We would never want again. If I claimed a dragon, they'd make you a lady.
I do not care to be a lady, Hugh. And neither do I want to be a widow.
So I guess they have introduced the notion that he has his eye on, not vanity per se, but he's thinking bigger picture. He's thinking, how can we rise up the ranks in society? And of course, that's the motivation that fuels his freaking betrayal. I just felt so gutted. Wait, that's funny because that's how he dies. I just felt so gutted when I read in the book that he spirals into one of the biggest betrayers of them all. I just was so shocked since they've introduced him to be, again, in my opinion, super humble. He comes from nothing. He's got so much to fight for right now. Like, you're rooting for him when he claims his dragon. But now I guess, maybe, I don't know, he'll spiral and continue to be poisoned by his own desires for, I just want a title, I want more wealth, like, I want to be repaid. You know, all of this kind of spirals in the book because he feels like he's not been rewarded significantly enough for everything he did to help Rhaenyra take the throne and whatnot. So I do still think there's an entirely plausible route in which he becomes jaded and, you know, starts to sour against her and his fellow Team Black Dragon Riders. But now I'm watching him. Now I'm especially intrigued and, you know, reading this and seeing where he ends up and, you know, juxtaposing that with the way in which they've painted his character for now. I really appreciate that they've introduced him to be, like, you know, unsuspecting and seemingly honorable, you know, seemingly has good, noble intentions. So to see where he ends up, you know, I'm especially excited, and hopefully he will get more, you know, screen time going forward because he turns into a massive player in all of this, and I'm gonna be watching him. Apologies if it's annoying to watch a book review and I'm just continuously comparing it to the television series adaptation, but that is the context in which I read this. As I said, honestly, I don't think I would have picked this up. I'm so glad that I did, but the true reason I read this in the first place was because I wanted to get some answers. I can't keep awaiting 2 years between seasons to know who wins. I'm out here rooting for Team Black with my life, y'all. I'm like, are we on the front lines for the winning team? So I had to know. If there's any Team Green or watching, feel free to argue with my claim that we win by technicality. Like, yeah, at the end of the day, Aegon does kill Rhaenyra, but regardless though, I am extremely grateful that I read this book. Please do let me know if you have read A Song of Ice and Fire and that whole series, if it's in any way, shape, or form similar to this. I imagine not, because again, the way that this is constructed is so unique and so different from anything that I've ever actually read. I would never ever tell anyone that this reads like a history textbook because in my opinion it was so much more enthralling than that. I think one of the most intriguing elements of this is the fact that a lot of this is open for interpretation because it's not factual, which I know is a reason a lot of people discouraged me from reading it, because it's not. You can't necessarily take it for face value, but I think that adds to the fun of it because then you get to draw your own interpretations and then follow up and see in the show what they decide to make concrete. But thank you guys so very much for watching. I've never filmed a book review before, so hopefully I did an okay job, but let me know if you think there's ways I could genuinely improve. I would love to hear your feedback, even though I don't read anywhere near enough that I would film these regularly, but I don't know, if you guys enjoyed this, then perhaps that will inspire me to read more, and regardless, thank you so very much for watching. Team Black banners still raised. Oh, and I think this might also either be my last video of 2024 or first video of 2025. Happy New Year in general. Yes, Happy New Year works either way. So whether it's still 2024 or 2025, I appreciate you guys watching and I hope you have a great new year, and I will see you guys again very, very soon. Bye guys.